On a cold spring afternoon in May 1982, two housewives, Ann Lee, 44, and Margaret Johnson, 66, were savagely murdered as they walked the dogs on Hungry Hill, Aldershot. They were both stabbed several times, but the killings appeared motiveless. Mrs. Lee, a mother of two, was discovered lying on the path at the top of a small hillock. Monty was pining by her side. Mrs. Johnson, a grandmother who had been married for 47 years, was 20 yards away, slumped by a 5-bar gate where she had run to escape. The lower rungs were covered in blood. Although the murders had been committed in daylight and the bodies found close to an army base, there were no witnesses. Robbery and rape were ruled out as potential motives and no weapon was found. There were two suspicious sightings on the day: a man wearing a camouflage jacket and a lorry driver, crying, with his head in his hands, seen close to the murder scene. The police dismissed both. Mrs. Lee, 44, the wife of a retired army major, left her home in Highfield Gardens, Aldershot, with her Labrador, Monty, to meet Mrs. Johnson, 66, the wife of a banking director, who lived in a nearby bungalow and owned a red setter called Tara. The two women were about halfway round their regular walk on the common when they were attacked and stabbed repeatedly with a double-edged knife. A former hospital porter who has spent nearly all his adult life behind bars after confessing to the murders of two women was cleared by the Court of Appeal yesterday. Peter Fell, 39, was described as a serial confessor who had been the victim of oppressive police interrogation. The court cleared him of killing Ann Lee, 44, the wife of a retired army major, and Margaret, Peggy, Johnson, 65, the wife of a banking director, who were repeatedly stabbed on Aldershot Common, Hampshire, while walking their dogs on a May afternoon in 1982. Mr. Fell's solicitor, Jim Nichol, said, "He may be a crackpot, he may be crazy, he may be all these things, and probably was in 1982, but a murderer he was not and never has been." Peter Fell was sentenced to 2 life terms in 1984 after being found guilty by a 10-2 majority verdict of a double murder which had occurred in 1982. He was convicted on the strength of his own confession and his supposed resemblance to a photo-fit picture of the killer. In December 2000 he was released on bail pending an appeal court hearing in March 2001 when his convictions were quashed. On the evening of the murder, he staggered out of a pub in Aldershot and called the police. He told an officer he had met a man who had told him he was the killer. Mr. Fell said the man lived at 10 York Road, his own address. The police did nothing, so Mr. Fell rang again the next day and offered the same information. It was another 2 weeks before he was questioned and then he was ruled out as a suspect. Detectives concluded he could not have been on the common at the time of the murder, and in any event, there was no motive. A year later, the police were no nearer to catching the killer and Mr. Fell, a hospital porter, had moved to Bournemouth. After another night of heavy drinking, he called the local police and said, "I know who did Bournemouth. Aldershot double murderer on May 10, 78. He gave his own name. Several days later he was interviewed by the police for nearly 10 hours in 7 sessions without a solicitor. To begin with, Mr. Fell denied involvement. "I have not murdered anyone," he told them. "Never have and never will, there's not a lot else I can say. I know the phone calls and all that. That's only because I wanted to be someone. I'm nobody." During subsequent interviews, Mr. Fell made a partial confession which he immediately retracted. He'd said he'd met the 2 women and had struck one of them with a stick because she looked like his mother. In the book Trial and Error, author David Jessel describes how officers were taped saying to Mr. Fell, "The sooner you see clear, my sunshine, the better, and, from the day you started to walk you lied." Still protesting his innocence, Mr. Fell was convicted of both murders in August 1984, at the end of a 19-day trial at Winchester Crown Court. Mr. Fell's tendency to make things up was well known to the police. During a spell in the army as a cook, he twice lied about being attacked by civilians. He also claimed he was an army boxing champion, another fantasy. He even tried to incriminate himself in the Yorkshire Ripper murders by phoning the police and giving them his name. His disturbed childhood also made him prone to attention-seeking. His parents split up when he was 3, and 2 sets of foster parents had given him up, leaving him in the care of a children's home. After considering his background and details of the confession, the Criminal Cases Review Commission referred the case back to the Court of Appeal in September 1999. Peter Fell now says his only crime was being foolish. He rang the police after the murders were publicized to say the murderer was called Pete and lived in York Road, Aldershot, his own address. He was interviewed and gave an account of his movements on that day, but was released without charge. A year later, with the murders still unsolved, the police received more calls from Fell, identifying himself as the killer. He was arrested and taken to Farnborough police station. He confessed after 72 hours questioning without a solicitor, and his supporters claim the facts in it did not match with the actual events. The confession was later retracted. His trial had lasted 19 days, and the jury of 6 men and 6 women deliberated for 25 hours and 30 minutes before reaching 10-2 majority verdicts of guilty for each murder. The court heard that Fell, who pleaded not guilty, had made 13 anonymous phone calls to police naming himself as the killer. The defense had not called him to give evidence, but during the trial, the jury was told that he had made a partial confession to police admitting he had killed the women, although he denied remembering anything about stabbing them. Fell, who has also claimed that he tried to incriminate himself for the Yorkshire Ripper murders, and his supporters say these are many aspects of his case that make the conviction unsafe. There was no forensic evidence. No murder weapon was found. He was not picked out at an identity parade. The police released him on bail for 3 months on the same day he made the confession. Detectives came close to charging a second man with the murders. His alibi that he was in a bank at the time of the killings stands up. A woman who was attacked in a similar fashion a year before the 2 murders says the photo fit of the double killer was the same man who attacked her. Fell was serving in Germany at the time she was attacked. A second woman has come forward since the publicity given to Fell's case to say she saw a crazy-looking man near the murder scene just an hour before the killings who was definitely not Fell. Fell has been described by psychiatrists as being a classic case attention seeker, who would lie and exaggerate to be noticed. The facts. On the afternoon of the 10th of May 1982, Anne Lee and Margaret Johnson were walking their dogs on Army Common land on the outskirts of Aldershot. The common is about 400 to 500 yards long by a shorter distance wide, in other words it is quite a small area. As the 2 women walked along a track bordered by a fence which marked the grounds of Anglesey House, a large house used by the military as a courts-martial centre, they were attacked by a man wielding a knife. That attack took place at approximately 3 to 12 p.m. At about 3 to 3 p.m. Molly Hogg, who was herself walking with a dog, found the body of Mrs. Lee lying face down, and she also saw the body of Mrs. Johnson lying on her side, some distance away, at the foot of a gate. The dogs of the 2 victims were still in the vicinity. The pathologist report showed that the death of the 2 victims was due to multiple stab wounds. Mrs. Lee had suffered 11 wounds to the back of her upper body, and Mrs. Johnson had suffered 5 wounds to the front of her chest. The wounds in relation to both victims ranged from 1 to 1.5 inches in width and penetrated up to 5 inches. Mrs. Johnson was measured and found to be 4 feet 10 inches tall. That was said to have some significance, in view of admissions made by the appellant in interview ultimately, that she resembled his mother. Persons on the common. The jury heard evidence from 6 witnesses who said that they saw a young dark-haired man on or near the common between 2 to 10 p.m. and 3 to 3 p.m. The appellant, it should be said, was aged 20 and about 5 feet 11 inches tall. His hair would be shortish. He had had a crew cut when in the army, from which he had been discharged in March of 1982, and there is a photograph amongst the exhibits taken some few weeks before May 1982 which seems to show the appellant with short hair. It is right to add that we were also shown a photograph taken in September 1982 which showed the appellant with much longer hair. In any event, his hair was dark brown. Sylvia Swainson and Joy Watley saw a young man wearing a camouflage jacket at about 2 to 10 p.m. Mrs. Swainson described the man as aged 18 to 25, between 5 feet 8 inches and 5 feet 10 inches, of slim build with short brown hair. Brian Hackney, a Ministry of Defence policeman, was jogging across the common when, as he assessed, at about 2 to 58 p.m. he overtook Mrs. Lee and Mrs. Johnson about 250 yards from the murder scene. About a minute later he passed a man who appeared to be unhappy. Mr. Hackney described this man as being in his early 20s, 5 feet 8 inches tall, of medium build with long, dark, unkempt hair and wearing a green anorak or an army-type jacket and possibly jeans. Also on the common was a group of soldiers including Richard Nicolich, Ian Loisy and Corporal Peter Waterman. Between 2